AI is here to stay. It's not just a buzzword. It's actually something that we're all going to have to live with, whether it's at work or at home. So the empowerment should really start with meeting employees where they're at and not going too fast, not introducing too much too quickly, but really give employees time to adapt, adjust, to give feedback so that the company can continuously try to improve those processes where we have AI. And really identifying those champions that can help with the rest of the employees, because it's not going to take just one team to implement AI. It's going to take everyone, and it's going to snowball. It has to be a snowball effect in terms of looking at the benefits of AI. And there's always going to be some pitfalls. There's always going to be some learnings along the way. So embrace the learnings and then move on and continue to work with AI.
Welcome to Pioneers, the show where we explore the intersection between humanity and AI. I'm your host, Ankur Patel. Over the last 10 years, I've built 3 AI startups, written 2 books about the subject, and I run a weekly AI newsletter. I also regularly teach and speak about the topic at conferences. This technology has grown faster than I think any of us could have imagined, and it's making us ask really important questions, such as how ethical is AI? What will this technology look like in a few years, let alone a few months? And most importantly, does it have the power to truly change the world? And what does it mean for you? On this show, I'll be interviewing the founders, operators, and pioneers that are introducing AI into their companies and industries. We'll be asking them the really heavy-hitting questions that make them dig deep into the core of what we do. And without further ado, let's dive into today's episode. Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Ankur Patel, and today I have Claire Grosjean, who is the Senior Director of Business Process Management and Strategic Innovations in Financial Processes at Technology Credit Union. Claire, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ankur.
For the benefit of our audience, do you mind just sharing a few words on your prior background and what it is that you do at Technology Credit Union?
Sure, we'd be happy to. So I was born and grew up in France and came to the US to get an MBA. And after that, I worked with financial industries, credit unions, banks, and mainly in finance and accounting. I was with Silicon Valley Bank for 17 years before the bank imploded last year. And for SVB, I was the controller and then moved into a director of program management role where I managed all the systems for the finance organization. And that's really when I got introduced to robotics process automation and had the opportunity to leverage automation anywhere to build bots. And we did a pilot and was successful with the finance organization. And then I moved over to the global operations team to continue to build on RPA, leverage workflow tools. And I also at the time managed a process improvement engineers team so that we combine process improvement and automation, as we did not want to automate a bad process. So I did that for about 8 years at Silicon Valley Bank. And I joined Technology Credit Union about a year ago, where I really led the process management team, the process improvement and automation teams focused on workflow more than RPA, in addition to supporting the business strategy for the entire credit union. So it was interesting to see the priorities of the credit union and how that would roll up to our vision mission and see how automation tools can then help us with creating efficiencies and increasing our member satisfaction.
Incredible background. I'm sure there's some incredible stories from SVB, the highs and the lows there. Might be better over drinks at another occasion.
For sure.
But maybe talking about RPA and process automation, right? So I think that obviously has been a topic that's been top of mind for a long time. It's not just like a new topic. And I think the challenge that we're seeing with RPA, is, at least in the public markets, when you look at the stock of a UiPath, is people are questioning how much RPA is able to do relative to some of the newer technology. So could you maybe share a little bit more light on what was RPA really good at? And then what open challenges did RPA have that remain unsolved?
Great question. So RPA served a purpose in terms of automating those role-based tasks that were very time-consuming. And it did work. We actually, when I left SVB, we had 55 bots in production. So it was definitely saving time and money from not having employees to do manual tasks. The challenge with RPA is that there was a cost of maintenance. So to maintain all those bots in production, both from a business and a technology standpoint, that came at a pretty high cost. In addition to taking into account changes, whether it was UI changes or upgrades or anything, there was a constant need to change the code and really update the bots. So I truly believe that RPA is here to stay, but that it needs to be complemented with more of an AI and more of an orchestration layer that can manage all the exceptions and that can do some of what the human were doing in terms of looking into the code and going into more of an API type integration so that the code is not subject to change and not have to change so often. So it was actually a great experience and a great step into getting into more of an AI landscape.
With RPA, in terms of the initial setup and the maintenance, who would that cost usually fall on? Would it be the internal team? Would it be teams of consultants that worked on setting up the bots? I'm curious what that looked like.
I'm sure that varies from company to company. What I found working was a mix of internal resources and supplement with external professional services that knew and had done that at other companies, so they knew the RPA technology. What I really found is that the biggest gap was knowing about the internal systems, how they worked, and how to integrate them with the RPA tools. So, for example, in our experience, we ended up starting with professional services and having just two of us from an internal standpoint. And then we built our internal center of excellence and brought people from internal, whether they were business or the technology side. And that was the winning ticket for us, is to have more of that internal knowledge.
And with RPA, did you go with one of the major players in the space, or did you decide to build your own platform to do that?
We ended up going with Automation Anywhere. And there was a good partnership with them. Actually, we had them on site because we're very much co-located in San Jose. So we had some user groups on site in the SVB office. And it was a good partnership at the time where Automation Anywhere was still fairly new and with the financial industry at least. And we looked at some of the other players, but for the needs that we had, because we already had a workflow tool at the table, Automation Anywhere was the best partner. And so we ended up staying with them for quite some time.
What's interesting with AI, and I agree with you, by the way, earlier when you said it needs to be more flexible, API integrations and API first, I think is a huge tenet of ours. And I think that allows you to not have the brittleness that RPA had. But with AI, a lot of companies are starting off with building off of hyperscalers, using things like Azure OpenAI. And it seems like they don't have a good platform approach to setting up these orchestrations, these agentic workflows that are becoming really popular. So I'm curious, like, what are your thoughts around the need for a new platform to go and support more AI automation, similar to like what Automation Anywhere and UiPath did in the world of robotic process automation?
I feel that we're still in the early years, and there are new companies coming out there. Semaphore, for example, is an example. It is one of the companies building agentic AI that's starting to really deploy them in production, so that we're transitioning from the typical RPA and workflow automation to more of an AI automation. So it's taking a little bit of time to build the code and then do the discovery. I also truly believe that it should be business-led and IT-enabled, so that you have to have the use cases at the table before then you spend the money from an IT standpoint. So those would come hand in hand. And we're starting to see some pretty good use cases around agentic AI and how that new technology will grow and help develop more automations.
Within an organization like yours, or similar to yours, what are the use cases that come to mind for AI automation?
So the typical ones would be in finance and accounting and around accounts payable. But what I have seen, most of the use cases are around operations. There's still a lot of manual work happening with the operations team in the case of a bank, having to take information from members or clients and then process that information into downstream systems. The challenge with those type of use cases is they're not standardized across industries, whereas accounts payable, for example, is more standardized, so it's an easier one to start with. But I would argue that the biggest use cases would be typically with operations team and having a lot of manual processes.
Yeah, accounts payable is a near and dear space. My last startup that I co-founded was in the accounts payable space, and we're going after Bill.com. So the needs are still there for many organizations, but I think operations and that business-led, IT-enabled, I think that piece that you mentioned earlier, I think is very, very relevant, right? And I think one of the fears is, what is going to be the reception of employees in these roles that are perhaps affected to some extent by some of the tasks being offloaded from their plate to more technology. So given your experience adopting RPA and then now working on AI automation as well. What do you think is the right playbook for getting employees to go and adopt and partner with some of the new tools that are coming about?
So my experience is really to start small with pilots and include employees early on and really have champions. So in other words, some of the employees that are more likely to adopt and be receptive to leveraging new technologies and really leverage their enthusiasm to then communicate to other employees and understand the art of the possible. And what we've done over time is creating demos so that there's the visual piece of what the AI or what the automation would do. And the fact that it's not going to be necessarily end to end. So there's still a human in the loop. There's still the need to have that human part of the automation. But creating demonstrations and having more visuals was definitely helpful in promoting the leverage of RPA or any type of AI tools.
I think that's a great point. I think the visualization allows the people, employees, to see what life could look like with AI supporting their work. And it's usually AI doing the work that they don't want to be doing. It's the more mundane, repetitive work around shifting through documents, maybe doing document classification, extraction, having some triaging, some initial decisions. But they get to spend more of their intellect and domain expertise on the more complex work. And when they see that firsthand, perhaps in a visualized manner, it doesn't seem as daunting because the nature of their tasks change, but it's not that you're doing their entire role, right? The role that they do is very, very complex. It's just the nature and the balance of tasks that they do on a daily basis changes, and showing them that the AI is taking on some of the more mundane work while they get to do more of the meaningful work ends up, I think, creating a better conversation, and I think leads to better adoption over time.
Completely agreed. It's more around the job satisfaction of not just dealing with data, but instead now you have more time to work with other employees or work with clients or work with third party. And I would say be more strategic in the way that you want to continue your work going forward. So I have seen some of those changes where, because you eliminate what's repetitive, now there's time to look at it from a higher level and say, okay, why am I doing this? Or could I do this different? And that's a different conversation.
Based on the work that you've done historically in the past as well, and perhaps now, do you have a good case study or example where AI was introduced or automation was introduced in a way where it was not only effective, but then there was good adoption from the employees?
So I have a couple of examples. One of them is a form that had to be filled out every year by clients at Silicon Valley Bank that has to do with the client attestation form. So it was a very repetitive, mundane of sending forms to all the clients, having them fill it out, come back, and then update systems if need be. In this case, introducing RPA to do the work, sending all the emails to clients, receiving the forms back, and then updating the systems saved so much time. And it was a task that in itself was very much regulatory in nature, but not necessarily value add. So those are the examples of tasks where, yes, a human needs to supervise, make sure it happens as intended. But the task itself was really not adding any value. So in that one, there was definitely a big gain in terms of employee productivity and not having to do something. Another example is when we also automated the overdraft process with the Silicon Valley Bank, where in the past, when we had clients going in overdraft, then the relationship managers were notified. They had to then decide what disposition was of the overdraft situation. And when we automated that, we allowed all the responses to stay within a workflow, as opposed to going through emails back and forth, and emails get lost and not everybody respond to emails. And there was not necessarily an audit trail and a date stamp on who had responded when. So that was also another way to contain that process that was highly visible and that had a financial impact for the bank. So that created visibility into how many overdrafts and also gave us some metrics around the dispositions of those overdraft accounts.
Those are beautiful examples. And I think earlier you mentioned also centers of excellence, having those stood up and that getting more adoption with RPA. I'm curious, how can organizations create an environment where AI empowers employees, and what actionable steps do you suggest they take to go and move in this AI automation space?
So it has to be a win-win situation for employees and the organization, because if you pick use cases that employees don't really care about, there won't really be much of an adoption. And then on the other hand, if you also ask all the employees, what use cases do you want to leverage, but then there's really no benefit for the organization, it's really not going to go far. So the idea is to tie those use cases to the strategic plan and see looking at all the objectives and all the strategic initiatives that would happen for the next 12 to 18 months and see where AI and automation in general can be leveraged so that you create a win-win situation. So you would go to the business owner of a certain initiative saying, okay, we're here to help you create efficiencies and not only leverage technology, but also looking at the process itself, see how we can improve it. And really create that win-win situation between the center of excellence and then the business units.
It seems like a lot of companies are starting with OpenAI models, like an Azure OpenAI model, and they're largely relying on prompting to solve some of the workflow automation that they're doing. I'm curious, how much of there is a need to perhaps customize the large language models, maybe perhaps through fine tuning and similar, to go and fit the unique needs of a particular department for your organization or similar organizations, where perhaps like the prompting itself doesn't lead to a sufficiently good outcome. I'm curious how much room or experimentation there has been on the customization of these models for the specific needs of different departments within your organization.
Good question. I feel that the prompting is good for general use. Working at a bank and financial institution, it is not something that we can easily deploy because there are a lot of risks and some ethical questions around the results of the prompting that we cannot underestimate. So in the financial services industry, we would want to create more internal models based on our own internal data and not based on public data. So the use of large language models such as OpenAI would not necessarily be favored, but there's an opportunity to build our own internal models so that the models that we would use then would be more relevant to the industry and the company we're working at. And because we need to understand, especially if those models lead to decision making, it cannot be done blindly. So I would argue that from a banking standpoint, it's still very early on to leverage those OpenAI type models. And it is definitely something we're looking into, but at a smaller scale.
It's interesting because it feels like what you're saying, and I agree with this, is that having models where you have a little bit more control over is preferred and it stays within your walls, and maybe perhaps it goes through model risk management more easily. So in your case, is it then open source models like a Llama 3 or 3.1 or some of the open source Mistral models as a starting point? And if so, I'm very curious, how do you think about model risk management over time? Because I imagine if these models are getting fine-tuned to some extent, it may need to go through model risk management every single iteration, right? It becomes very, very difficult and perhaps operationally expensive to do, especially if many models across many, many workflows.
Good question. And I would say we're not quite there yet where at the organization where I'm at, just because we're still learning and being careful around where we leverage AI. And we're looking into leveraging different type of models, but if it leads to a credit decisioning or some other type of decisions, then there's going to be a lot more scrutiny. So we're testing those different models, but we have not deployed any of those models in production yet. So as we deploy those models in production, then that's when we have to think about the risk governance, and that will come into place at that time. So we're still very much into just looking into the different models.
That makes a lot of sense that this is a period of experimentation and learning still. And, we hear that a lot, POCs and pilots underway, some in-house, some with external providers. How do you set up really great criteria for success for these POCs and pilots? Is it a cost reduction exercise? You're looking at how much OpEx you can reduce, or are there other parameters that organizations should be thinking about in terms of thinking about success for a POC or a pilot?
Ideally, the metrics would be around value realization, and I would define that as cost savings, cost avoidance, or additional revenues. In our case, it could also be in terms of reduced charge-offs or losses, operational losses. So if we do have some AI models that can help us reduce operational losses because they reduce fraud and there's more of an incentive, then there would definitely be those favored models. I would say nowadays would be around revenue generation. And I'll give you an example of lending activities. And based on a member or client situations in life, maybe their demographics in terms of age and where they are is recommend the next best product to sell to them. And I know that there are some companies starting to do that so that you include different different models, different data, and then you have your relationship managers start recommending different products that they would then. And if you were to gamify it, that would be even better. So really having kind of the next offering and the next product and try to see how you can motivate the sales team to then sell those without, being pushy or anything. So I do think that's the next opportunity that would go a long way beyond the cost avoidance and the cost savings.
What skills do you think are essential for employees that are looking to thrive alongside some of the new AI technologies that are coming online?
I would say a thirst for learning, because that area changes so quickly, and definitely the motivation to look at different type of webinars and read and continue to educate themselves, in addition to understanding the practicality of those different AI technologies, because it's one thing to have a great AI tool, but if it's not really going to do anything, and again, it has to be pragmatic and really have some type of benefits for the business to then really leverage and implement. So having both the thirst to learn and then I would say the business acumen to really understand where those technologies can be leveraged and what is the outcome. So what can you expect as an outcome, and to think big, because if we do think big and then that's when you can make a difference.
I think that's so true for both the organization and the people, which is this is a time to experiment, to learn, to embrace some of the new technology. I think the ones that get hurt the most are the ones that they shy away from adoption altogether. They think that if they just stay away, that somehow they could avoid the problem. And that's just not true organizationally or at an individual level, right? So I think you do have to go and adapt. And I think the sooner you adapt with the level of openness, the better and easier it becomes, right? Because this is not a technology that you could kind of sit out. Right? It's going to affect a lot of the work and the future of work. And I think that in most cases, it should be empowering. And I think a lot of what organizations need to manage is how to make that empowerment happen, right? And so as we think through employees and the organization, finding better ways for there to be AI adoption and empowerment for employees, what are things that you think organizations could do on some of the job displacement that could potentially happen due to automation?
Sure. So I truly feel that most of the AI that's been introduced helps and enhances employee experience, and it goes hand to hand. So in other words, there may be 10% of somebody's job that may be displaced, but they still have 90% to do, and then they can learn how to do something else. And as companies continue to scale, one of the goals is not to have to add necessarily a lot of employees to then be able to handle the additional volumes and additional business that would come in. So there's a lot of growth where employee would not be displaced as much and could learn other skills and maybe join other departments. So it's a combination of being curious and try to stay relevant, whether it is AI related or relevant to maybe some of the other open positions that are at the organization, understand what skills are needed for those roles and start learning those skills on their own and not wait for something to happen for them to really upskill. So it's a combination of what the company can do for employees and also what employees can do for themselves so that they're not left behind when something does happen.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think in the industries that we often work in, which is financial services as well as insurance, you have a demographics trend where it's frankly harder to hire for some of these roles, especially as some of the generations are about to retire, exit the workforce. You don't necessarily have equally skilled younger generations who are entering into the fray necessarily. And so part of this is how can you do more with the same team that you have, allowing software to help kind of offset some of the demographic effect, I think is going to be a huge part of this story as well.
Yes, and I would add too, Ankur, that one of the big challenges is when you automate a process, and over the years, you no longer have employees who know how to do the process. So there's also a challenge around now we've automated processes, and if something were to go wrong, or if we need to then take it back and perform that process manually, you no longer have the knowledge. So it is something that I really stress on and that we are working on here at the Career Union is to document our processes to make sure that we know what does what. It is a work in progress. I truly believe there is an opportunity for AI around knowledge management and understanding all of the information that's available within the organization around how to do things that sometimes is locked into team sites or locked into different systems. and having an AI tool that can be an overlay around all of that documentation and really help employees understand how those processes are being done and render some of the relevant information. I feel that's a great use case for companies.
I completely agree. And in some cases, it's also great for training new employees on the job, right? Because you've documented the process. Perhaps you've made it available for employees to search against and find answers more quickly. So maybe co-pilot experiences. But if you're trying to learn a new process, it's relatively new. You shouldn't have to always ask internal employees because that also creates a lot of cost, right? And it's inefficient. But if you could have that available through like these co-pilot experiences or chatbots, that allows junior employees to get upskilled pretty quickly, and therefore they could be more effective in terms of their roles. I also think the other piece that you mentioned earlier is really relevant, which is redesigning process that's perhaps broken. The only way you could do a redesign is if you could actually document it on paper or in a visual format where you could see the steps and the actions and then streamline that, right? So it's process redesign and then automating that redesigned process. So it's a combination of many things that allows you to become much more effective as an organization.
Definitely. I've also seen where you add new processes to an organization, and as opposed to performing them manually, you already look into how to automate it. So it's a very different concept because you're not looking at people performing that process, but you're looking at systems and automations directly. And I feel that's a power of AI and automation in general, where you're not constrained to then doing it manually first and then automating it. You can, if you introduce a new product, a new service, you can already look at automating some of the steps related to that product or service.
Given that we're in a regulated space, how do you balance automation with the need for human oversight in these decision-making processes?
So I would definitely advise companies to have an AI policy so that at least there's a centralized way and looking at AI, so that typically there would be tied with an AI subcommittee, so that when AI is introduced through new vendor systems, then there's human looking at what are we looking to do, what are some of the risks, and how can we mitigate those risks. That also allows employees and frankly, even the leadership team to learn about those new AI technologies and what they can actually take advantage of versus maybe something that they're not quite ready to do. So it also allows organizations to then implement AI slowly and I would say as quickly as they're comfortable with. And also it allows regulators to then understand what's happening so that when audits and happen, then there's already documentation.
I love that. Well, maybe to close off, what's one key takeaway you want listeners to have about empowering employees with AI? Curious what that would be.
Sure. AI is here to stay. It's not just a buzzword. It's actually something that we're all going to have to live with, whether it's at work or at home. So the empowerment should really start with meeting employees where they're at and not going too fast, not introducing too much too quickly, but really give employees time to adapt, adjust, to give feedback so that the company can continuously try to improve those processes where we have AI. And really identifying those champions that can help with the rest of the employees, because it's not going to take just one team to implement AI. It's going to take everyone and it's going to snowball. It has to be a snowball effect in terms of looking at the benefits of AI. And there's always going to be some pitfalls. There's always going to be some learnings along the way. So embrace the learnings and then move on and continue to work with AI. And I feel that as an employee myself, there's a lot of opportunities that I see at the companies taking advantage of that we have not taken advantage of. And I question, why don't we do this? And it's a matter of time and it's a matter of being ready. So again, we really have to be careful about not chasing the next shiny object, but really leveraging what we already have and working with our employees to make sure that we're comfortable embracing AI and that we can really leverage it to its fullest.
I think that's great advice. I mean, I think AI is here to stay, but you still need a methodical and measured approach. Just because the technology is ready doesn't mean the organization and the teams are ready to adopt it all at once, right? It's going to take a little bit of time for it to really process and go through the system. But the sooner you start that journey, the better and easier it becomes, right? Because it's not going anywhere. If anything, the longer you delay, the harder it becomes. Claire, for the benefit of our audience, if they want more information on you or your firm, what's the best place for them to go and look?
So I would say LinkedIn is probably the best place, and I would love to connect and chat about what other companies are doing so that I can also learn and help where I can.
Amazing. Well, Claire, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you for the time, and look forward to having you on a future podcast where we maybe go through and see all the different AI automation that you've been up to.
Thank you so much, Ankur.